Our new Minister for Common Sense, former GB News star Esther McVey, came out with fighting talk today with a piece in the Daily Mail setting out her priorities for setting the country back on a path of prudence and pragmatism. Esther declares a war on woke, particularly on public sector waste and absurdly foolish employment practices. Taxpayer value for money is essential, and with so much taxpayer cash, that's your cash, ladies and gentlemen, being wasted on vacuous and self-righteous roles such as diversity officers, we need something to be done to stop this happening. Interestingly, according to a Freedom of Information request from the Taxpayers Alliance, last year the NHS, the National Health Service in England, turned out to employ 800 diversity and inclusion officers, costing a total of £40 million per annum. Many of these people are paid more than nurses, who I think most of you would think are a bit more useful. Ms McVey also slams bizarre employment practices within the public sector, which waste your cash, a particularly egregious scandal during a period of record inflation and a cost of living crisis. One example that may irritate as much as amuse you is that some local councils who have found their staff don't go into work are paying the self-same staff their heating bills so they can carry on not working from home. This is a terrible, wasteful use of taxpayers' money, and this type of inefficiency deserves to be curbed. Public sector workers are public servants, and they need to be allowed to get on with their jobs, not spend all their time and energy in moralistic progressivism, which can, as we discovered with Aviva last week. Do you remember that? Aviva don't like white men, so you can only get a job with them if the Grand Fromage, whose name I think is blank, thinks you should be allowed. So it ends up that diversity becomes discrimination in not just the public sector, but can in the private sector too. So the Minister for Common Sense was brought in to make sure that employees can spend their time doing the jobs for which they're paid, not worrying about whose tender sensitivities they may offend, nor complying with ever-emerging newspeak, nor filling a gender or race diversity quota. And this is a great aim for Esther. I wish her success. I want her to succeed. It is fundamentally important. It will lead to a better, more efficient state. But there is a difficulty. And the difficulty is the Equality Act, which creates the public sector equality duty, which has put wokery into legislative form. Before she can really win her battle, this bill will need to be repealed. And that way, taxpayer value can be restored. As usual, as ever, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com, but I'm now joined by the Director of Data and Impact at the Free Speech Union, not the author of Silence of the Lambs, but nonetheless a very distinguished Thomas Harris. Thomas, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Jacob.
Everyone wishes Esther well, but is the legislative framework there for her to be able to do it?
Well, you're right that the Equality Act, since it came in 2010, has created this sort of privileged class according to gender identity, sexuality, race, and we've seen that at the Free Speech Union. We've had over 2,250 cases. And interestingly, since we were formed in February 2020, but interestingly, we win over 70% of those cases. So what that says to me is that companies are not actually applying the law appropriately. A good example would be the Forstater finding, which said that gender-critical views, so believing a man can't become a woman or that a woman can't become a man, they have now been proved to be protected under the Equality Act. But what we found is that although that is now established, companies, public sector organisations, Whitehall, aren't yet recognising that and putting that into practice.
And they spend a lot of time and money, particularly in the public sector, with diversity officers, trying to enforce particular views on people who work for them and criticising them if they don't go along with this.
That's right. I mean, Esther McVey today said she wanted to eliminate groupthink. Well, what we found is that these equality, these diversity and inclusion policies, when they've been implemented, have done quite the reverse. Because it's the same old critical race theory in the case of racial issues, or it's gender ideology and extreme transgender ideology in the case of gender issues.
And the gender ideology does bash up against other protected characteristics. A few months ago, a young Muslim gentleman came up to me who is a civil servant and said to me that he found it very difficult to accept these gender views that he was almost required to hold in the department he works in, which I won't say because I don't want to identify him, but he works in a important government department, and he found this clashed with his religion. So you have one bit of equality bashing against another, and which wins in these circumstances?
That's exactly the right question. We're starting to see more and more of that as each side in the sort of battle for the protected characteristics fights it out. We are seeing these skirmishes start to arrive, and I don't think that that's fully been appreciated or understood. And yet we're still seeing them pushed so hard by the same old providers, especially external providers of diversity and inclusion, who are not regulated, by the way.
And once you create diversity and inclusion officers, they have a job to do, don't they? They have to go around and prove that things aren't working. Otherwise, why on earth have they got a job? So they have a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy to create problems rather than just letting people get on with their job.
Yes, if they were brilliant at their jobs and they sorted out all of these inequality issues or lack of inclusion, and they got that sorted, there'd be a time limit on it. And in 2 years' time, they'd say, right, okay, we're going home now. We've done the job.
But in a different world, could you be a diversity and inclusion officer advocating for free speech? Is there a role that they could fulfill that would be useful?
I think there is a sense in which that could happen. I mean, a good example here is the higher education sector, where we now actually do have, in Professor Arif Ahmed, a director of free speech and academic freedom in the Office for Students. And that is going to be very interesting to see how this new protected issue of free speech works out in that forum. And we'll see if we can apply that, or something similar could be applied in Whitehall.
Because you obviously want people to be in a working environment where they're treated fairly and they're treated justly. And isn't that the underlying aim of the diversity inclusion officers, even if sometimes it goes wrong?
The theoretical ideas of inclusion and the theoretical ideas of diversity, very few people would debate with those and say that's wrong. It's just the practical outworking of this is so the opposite of groupthink. It's unidimensional.
So are you more optimistic than I am? Because I think Esther will succeed if she repeals the Equalities Act. But do I get the impression that you think it can succeed just by moral drive and the power of her personality to push this through Whitehall, that she can do it within the current law because the intention is benign?
I'm optimistic about the higher education world, given that we've got Professor Arif Ahmed and the Office for Students now. I'm less optimistic when it comes to other areas of the public sector, because those teeth that new role has are just not there. So this new code of conduct, or whatever it is that Esther McVey rolls out, could just be ignored. So in that way, I agree that really is to be tested, and I might be a little bit more pessimistic about that.
All right. Well, nonetheless, we wish Esther well, and thank you very much, Thomas. Coming up, trans guidance in schools.